In the summer of 2015, we were expecting a baby, and we'd had a somewhat problematic marriage for a while. I was upset about a number of things, and not the least of which was the way my wife was treating my older son. There were other problems as well. I'm not going to get into them here, but things weren't wonderful. And in the middle of all this, as the baby was coming along, I began to get sick. Now, I've always been an extremely healthy person. In fact, my entire adult life, I have been in outstanding physical condition, and I have been very concerned with nutrition and with making sure that I ate healthy food and that I took care of my body. Of course, in my 30s, having the kind of life that I did, I had very physically demanding jobs in the trades, and I also exercised. Every doctor's checkup I had was perfect. There was no history of heart disease on either side of my family, as far back as records have been kept. The only issues I really had were the ones that I caused myself through driving my body too hard. I herniated a disc in my neck when I was 31. By my mid-30s, I had developed multi-level degenerative disc disease in my lower lumbar spine. And by my late 30s, my orthopedist told me in no uncertain terms that it was time to stop working in a physical labor type of job and move on to a desk job if I wanted to keep from being crippled. My lumbar issues are fairly severe. I did make the transition from physical labor to a desk job, or at least I did for a while. And it was that I was doing around the time that I'm talking about. I had transitioned from one career to another, and I was working my way back up to an acceptable pay level, starting out again at the bottom. It was stressful, and when I began to get sick, that is what I initially blamed them on. It began with a headache, not just any headache. I woke up at 3 in the morning, and it was such an incredibly intense headache that I was almost vomiting from it. I noticed that my sheets were soaking wet with sweat, and it was weird. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before. I mean, I had been hungover before, and that was the nearest that I could describe what was happening. But this was different. So around the same time, I noticed I was getting a bit of a sore throat, and my sinuses were congested. So the sore throat didn't go away, and the congestion got worse. You know, I had a regularly scheduled checkup with my doctor around that time, and I mentioned these things to him. And he examined my throat, and he said, "Yeah, your throat looks a little red." He said, "I'm going to test you for strep." He said, "And as far as the decongestants you've been taking for your sinuses," he said, "you need to lay off on those. They're not good for you." He said, "What I want you to do instead is get a neti pot and use that." So he tested me for strep. I came up negative, and I did get a neti pot, and I used that, and it did something to relieve the congestion. But around that time, the well that I had used for 7 years without really a problem, began to get pretty bad. There wasn't a real effective means of keeping water runoff from rain out of the well. So when it would rain, the water would turn, you know, a dingy color for a few days. And I noticed that as time went on, that dingy color got darker and darker. In short order, I started to get really sick. Not only did the headaches become a common occurrence, but they got worse. Uh, they were almost every night, and it started to interfere with work. In addition, my sore throat got worse. Um, the congestion stayed around the same, but I began to have sleep issues, and I noticed that every night I was sweating so much that the sheets were completely soaked in it. And I noticed that I was getting really sensitive to fumes and cool air. Um, I was also losing weight. Uh, I had no appetite. I would still cook for the family, but I wasn't able to eat much. And it didn't seem to bother me that I wasn't eating. Um, my back issues seemed to get a lot worse as well. And all of these things taken together, they became severe enough and they disrupted my life enough that my boss got tired of it. And he told me that it was either part-time or, I get a new job. And I told him that, I couldn't work part-time. She had a baby and she was staying home with the baby, on maternity leave. And that left us with only one income. And if that income was reduced, I didn't know what we were going to do. And he said, "That's fine. Well, then you're done." He said, "I'll give you another month, and if you write me a letter of resignation, then you can have 5, 6 weeks." So that's what I did, and after the baby came along, I started getting much sicker. I tried to hide this from everybody, but there was just no hiding it. The sore throat thing became more developed. I don't have any other way to put it. It started up top of my esophagus, like right in the back of my throat, but it gradually moved its way down. And when it got to the point where I felt like it was branching off into my lungs, that area there started to be very problematic for me. The headaches got worse, the sleep disruption worse, my back aches worse, my night sweats were unbelievably gross. I can't tell you what it's like to wake up in the middle of the night, and feel like you're swimming, because you've soaked through all the sheets and blankets. It was terrible. And as things progressed, other things went wrong with me as well. I would feel these stabbing pains in the flesh of my toes and in my Achilles tendons on the back of my heels, in the middle of the night. And then there would be these days where, in addition to everything else, my feet were all swollen and bruised, and I wasn't doing anything to them. At that point, I was too tired all the time to exercise anymore. Um, the sleep disruption and the fatigue and the insomnia were all taking a toll. And the most sleep that I could hope to get was a couple hours at a time. And at that time, it also got colder. You know, we were moving our way towards Christmas. It was November when I realized that I was having kind of a reaction to cool air. And it hurt. Breathing cold air hurt my lungs. And I found that I was extremely sensitive to fumes. Um, and when I say fumes, I mean anything from alcohol to gas, to fueling my car, to citronella from our tiki torches, um, any kind of chemical odor at all. I was very sensitive to, and it would give me a headache, and it would set off that thing in my throat again. So naturally, I began to get really concerned about this. And at this point, I was starting to look gaunt. Um, around November, it was that I noticed that I had lost almost 20 pounds from the summertime. And I wasn't a guy who could afford to lose 20 pounds at that point. Um, I was looking kind of emaciated, and my mom was saying things like, are you eating? You look too skinny. And she's my mom and she's half Italian, so she's going to say that anyway, but now she was really concerned about it, you know. And I started calling my doctor more and more frequently. And I, as the months progressed, I started being more demanding with my doctor. I wanted answers because something was clearly very wrong with me. Um, I remember November was when it really all started to feel like I was incapacitated. There were days when I just couldn't walk. My feet were swollen. They were bruised. It started out very faint. I've got a picture here of how it started. Um, you can see the bruising there on the side of my foot. It's starting to turn purple. By late November, that had completely taken over my feet on the sides and on the backs and on the bottoms. And it was so dark and so bad and so painful that I just can't describe it. Even a cane wouldn't have helped me. There were days when all I could do was sit at my desk at home because by that time, of course, my job was long over. And although I was applying for new ones, there was no way I could go back to work in my condition. So my wife's behavior became extremely odd during this time as well. Um, Although we were facing serious money issues because my boss fought my unemployment claim, and he used the letter of resignation that he had demanded from me as proof. Um, so I had no income, and I couldn't get a job that I could work. Um, I was trying to find work from home jobs because I was at that point sick all the time. But I knew that my wife was still having an income. She eventually was fired from her job as well because she didn't want to come back to work after the baby was born. So they allowed her to claim unemployment, and I knew that she had an income. But when I said, we're going to have to move, we can't stay here anymore, she made no offer to help us, and she claimed not to have any money, which I thought was very odd because I knew she had money. She had stopped using the joint account months previously. Um, and I knew that she had always wanted to go back to Oregon. She hated Pennsylvania, hated the area, hated the people, hated her job, hated the people at her job. Um, she just hated everything about this place. And it hadn't started out that way. When we were first together, everything was fine and wonderful as long as we were together. And her outlook, I'm sorry, had considerably soured since then, and she was being mean to my older son, and I was very down on the marriage myself, but I was also at the same time aware that I was extremely sick and nobody could figure out what was wrong with me. So in February, I realized that we'd have to move. So I started a GoFundMe, and my friends chipped in enough money for me to be able to move my family to another place. And around that time, I remember becoming very upset with my doctors. They were plural by that point because something was clearly wrong with me, and I was no longer taking my doctor's excuses for not knowing what was happening. Um, I was looking on the internet for any information that I could find about what might be wrong with me. And the one thing that seemed to fit all of my symptoms was that I was being poisoned. And the only source of poisoning that I could possibly think of was the well. And okay, here's a picture of our well water at that time. Now, it wasn't that way all the time, but after a rain, when all the runoff from the ground leaked into the well, we would have like 3 days after the rain was done when the water looked like that. And although we filtered it, and although, you know, I made sure that nobody drank it but me, it was clear that it was a situation that couldn't continue. Um, our landlords had dug an additional well right after the baby was born, which was a nightmare, by the way. They were tracking mud through our house, and the landlords were, not the well diggers. And the well digging equipment was on every day. You know, they had to find 5 different places to dig it before they got acceptable water. And the machinery was loud, and it drove the baby crazy. And she used to take the baby and go sit in her car and put on music up in the driveway near the road. And I was pretty upset. I went so far as to have the well tested. So I ordered the well test, and before the results came back, I had my first, I guess I want to call it, attack. My sensitivity to fumes had gotten so acute that I could no longer be in the same room with a citronella candle. And if I happened to breathe just one breathful of cool air, this clenching thing would happen in my throat. And they were clenching pangs. But it was very definitely all in my respiratory system at that point. Later on, I did have chest pains that were associated with cardiac damage. Okay, so I know the difference. And back then, it was clearly something that was happening with my airways. The headaches were intense. They were amazingly bad. My joint aches were awful. At that point, I had lost something like 30 pounds. I looked like a skeleton. The thing with my feet and my toes and the weakness and fatigue was just, I was incapacitated. I had never been incapacitated in my life. And it was scary. And the worst part of it all was not knowing what was wrong. I was not in control of what was happening to me, and I felt like I was dying. So a day came when I went to pick up my son, and I had to run a bit to get to him. And it was one of the days when my feet were cooperating with me and they weren't swollen and I could actually use them. So I went to get my son at the school. We were parked a block away. And by the time I got back to the car, I couldn't breathe. Um, this clenching, awful, stabbing pain was happening in my throat, and I could not get enough air. I was gasping. And it was a while before I could say anything. And I noticed that my wife didn't seem upset or concerned. She seemed really curious, like interested, but I want to say it was the kind of interesting, like when you're watching a science experiment go wrong and something really crazy is happening. It was that kind of interest. And when I could talk again, I called my doctor, and he said, okay, tomorrow you're going to go in for a chest x-ray. He said, all I can think of is that it might be pleurisy. And I said, well, what about the sweats and the feet? And he said, well, no, that doesn't explain that, but it explains your chest. So I went and I got the chest x-ray, and they sent him the results electronically, and he called me back and he said, well, your chest x-ray is normal. He said, so we're going to try something else tomorrow. But that never ended up happening, because that night, um, and thank God my older son wasn't there, I woke up again at 4 in the morning. It seemed like that was the witching hour for me. That was when all the bad things happened at their worst. I woke up with another headache, so bad that I couldn't see. There were floating bits of light in my vision, and I was nauseous, and my feet were acting up again, and of course I had sweat through all the sheets and blankets, and I went into the bathroom, and it seemed like the only thing that could calm down my breathing when I was breathing fumes or cold air was steam from the shower. So as I was breathing in the steam, even as the throat thing was starting to calm down, it was also getting worse. And right at the bottom of my throat, this clenching pain happened, and it radiated outwards. It's the only way I can describe it. It radiated outwards from that spot. And I felt my whole body stop every time that happened. Like everything inside of me stopped, like it was being squeezed and stabbed at the same time. And I realized that I couldn't stand. I was laying on the floor of the tub with the hot water over my body. Now, in 3 days' time, we were supposed to move. She was sick, the baby was sick, and she wasn't helping. Most of her things had been packed, yeah, but our things hadn't been packed. And there was an urgency um, to everything. Everything in our lives was an emergency. So I yelled for her, and she came out of the bedroom. Again, no concern on her face at all. And she said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "I'm in trouble. I need to go to the hospital." So she brought me my phone, and I called the ambulance. And the ambulance came, and well, we lived in a little valley. We were on the banks of a very shallow, very wide stream. It was a creek called the Cana de Gwinnett. And so there was a steep bank to get down our driveway. And it was very muddy. The landlords didn't keep it, they didn't pave it, and they had thrown gravel down right before I moved in 7 years previously. And they had never refreshed it, even though I had asked them several times, and the gravel had washed away into the yard. And so it was all mud. So naturally, the ambulance gets stuck in the mud trying to get up the hill and out of the driveway. Matter of fact, they slid backwards and hit one of the telephone poles that was in our yard. And they damaged that, and they broke a rear view mirror. And so they had to call another ambulance. And that ambulance stayed at the top of the hill. And they moved me into that one. And then I went to the hospital. And when I got there, the results from the well test still hadn't come back yet. So that was very much on my mind. And I said to them that I believed that what was wrong with me was that I had been slowly poisoned by drinking water from this well. It was the only thing I could think of. So they did a heavy metal panel test on my blood. They did a number of blood tests, and they said to me, well, you do have elevated levels of arsenic in your blood. They said it would not be enough to explain an acute reaction like you're having now. They said a further concern is the fact that you have a protein in your blood that is only released when there is damage to the heart muscle. So I thought, oh great, this has spread to my heart now. And that certainly did explain the clenching feelings that I had in my throat and in my chest. So when they got me to the hospital, they put a couple bags of IV fluids in me. And it felt like, once they put all that fluid in me and they diluted my blood or whatever, I don't know, that it seemed to take the edge off somehow, And they said to me, well, because of this protein, we want to do a heart catheterization with you tomorrow. Now, keep in mind, I hadn't packed up our stuff yet, and she wasn't packing up our stuff. We had to move in 2 days. And I said, well, what does that mean? What's it going to do? And they were like, well, we're going to have to go in through your thigh and thread up through your arteries. And I said, well, how soon will I be out of the hospital after that? And they said, well, if all goes well, you'll be here for days. I was like, no, I can't do that. I can't do that. But keep in mind, I had been sick for a long time, and I was struggling to get anything done. My nephews were coming the day after next with my dad to move all our shit. And we had to be ready for that. And she wasn't giving me any help. I didn't understand why she was behaving that way. None of it made sense to me. It was like she didn't care whether we got out of there or not. Knowing what I know now, it all makes sense, of course, but back then I was stumped. So I signed myself out of the hospital against medical advice. And when I got home, I wasn't really able to do anything the next day. It was Saturday. This had happened on a Friday night, and I felt so weak. And every time I breathed the cold air or fumes from some of the stuff that we had, like the citronella from the tiki torches or stuff, that clenching thing would happen again. And of course, she was on me all the time back then, and this was no exception. She called me weak and lazy, and the doctors had suspected that I had had a heart attack, a minor heart attack. And I was insistent that that wasn't what was going on. And while that may have been part of what was going on, it certainly wasn't the whole story. It wasn't even most of the story. All those other symptoms, were in full raging swing, and that had nothing to do with heart disease whatsoever. They were classic poisoning symptoms. So that was her thing. She would call me weak and lazy and pathetic and all that stuff back then. And so I called the doctor on that Saturday, and of course they weren't in. I talked to the emergency nurse, and she said to me, you know, a lot of those symptoms you have sound like they could be Lyme disease. And of course, it wasn't Lyme disease. I mean, it wasn't. Some of the symptoms were consistent with Lyme, but not all of them. But you know, she was the first person who offered me any kind of an answer. And so I seized on it. And I said, well, if it is Lyme disease, what do I do? She said, well, you know, antibiotics. She said, if you've got any laying around the house, I would take them now. And I would take them all weekend until you could come in on Monday and see us. So that's what I did. And my nephews came, and my dad came, and they moved all the stuff. And I was weak as a kitten. I couldn't lift anything. It was, I had never felt that way before. I had never been so helpless in my life. But they got us moved. And all that was left was small stuff, you know, and I would come back for carloads of it. And it would take me like an hour to load the car because I would have to sit inside the house next to a space heater, breathing warm air for long enough that I could drag another load up to the car. And then from there up to the house. And on one of the first trips out, I guess I had forgotten to empty one of the tiki torches all the way, and we had this citronella fuel in them to drive the bugs away, and just that little bit that spilled in the back seat affected me so strongly that I couldn't drive with the windows closed. And it was wintertime, you know, and I had cold air breathing issues, you know. It felt like something was living in my lungs, you know. And it felt like whatever that was the center of it all, and everything was radiating out from that. But I went and I eventually saw the doctor, and I changed doctors. I changed doctors like 2 or 3 times in the next month because they all took loads of blood and tested me for this and that and the other thing, and they couldn't tell me what was wrong. And they did test me for Lyme repeatedly. They tested me for that, and my new doctor tested me for ehrlichiosis, and there were all kinds of other diseases, and rheumatoid diseases, and I was tested for everything under the sun. And when they couldn't find anything, my doctor referred me to the infectious disease unit at Hershey Penn Medical Center, and I spent the next month and a half going to them and being tested for everything under the sun. And they told me, they said, we can tell you definitively that you don't have an infectious disease of any kind. You are not this way because a tick bit you or a spider bit you or because you inhaled something alive, because there are bacteria or viruses or this. That's not what this is about. And around that time, my wife started spending time away. She went to visit her parents with the baby, and then she went to pursue her trumped-up lawsuit against the University of North Carolina that expelled her for good reason, you know, but she claimed they hadn't. And in the end, they settled, of course. But we'll get to that in another video. So she was gone. And while she was gone, all of these symptoms started to go away. It was gradual. It took a while, but they started to clear up. It gradually, slowly but surely, every day was slightly better than the one before it. But as all of those other symptoms began to lessen, I noticed that I was having chest pains and problems exerting myself. I couldn't exercise. When I started exercising, I would get chest pains that were different from what had happened to put me in the hospital in February. I didn't know what was going on. So after I was discharged from Hershey, my doctor referred me to a cardiologist. And by that time, everything had cleared up except for the chest pains. The breathing issues were gone. Sensitivity to fumes, gone. The weakness, well, that was still kind of there, but it was kind of tied to the chest pains now. The inability to breathe cold air, gone. The swelling and bruising in my feet, gone. The night sweats, gone. The back pain, it was back to normal. I was starting to gain weight again. I looked almost normal. The headaches, gone. But then, of course, the chest pains got worse and the inability to exert myself got worse. So in June of 2016, a year after all this had started, I finally won my unemployment case, and I was okay that way. I was finally getting an income again, and I was still having problems going up steps like real fast or walking up hills. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it at all. So something was going wrong. It was going wrong with my chest, and it was getting worse. But everything else had disappeared. So they wanted to do a CT scan of my chest, and my insurance turned it down. They said that first we had to do a nuclear stress test. So they did the nuclear stress test. Well, they tried to do it in early July, and I wasn't able to even last 30 seconds. They couldn't get my heart rate up to even normal before I had to stop. So they said that I failed that test. Of course I did. And they demanded the CT scan, and this time my insurance company approved it. So I guess it was July 13th, 2016. I got my CT scan, and I lived an hour away from the facility. So, they called me before I got home, and I didn't answer because I was driving. So I called them back when I got home, and they said, you need to pack a bag and go to the hospital now. Just turn around and go. And I said, why? They said, well, your life's in danger. You need to go now. So I packed a bag, and I got my wife to drive me to the hospital. And they did catheterization. They found the damage. And while I was there in the operating theater getting scheduled for surgery, a storm came and knocked out power to the operating theater. So they had to fly me by helicopter from Lancaster to Philadelphia, where the doctors at UPenn successfully did their procedure, and they fixed me. So as I recovered from surgery, I noticed that I was back. It's the only way I could put it. I mean, I've got damage. I can feel it. There's stuff in my lungs. There's damage to my lungs. There's damage to my feet that still acts up sometimes. It's not like before, but it's. I don't know how I can describe this unless you've been injured and you were injured long ago. You can feel your old injuries. They never really go away if they're severe enough, and the shadows of them remain. There's damage there. you know, and you're always going to feel it at certain times. Um, I feel it in my feet sometimes. I feel it in my lungs sometimes. That's it. So from July of 2016 up until June of 2017, I underwent all kinds of other tests. And this time, they were discovering what the heck could have gone wrong to cause that damage to my heart. They were stumped. Cholesterol is perfect. My blood pressure was perfect. Up until, of course, I started having those clenching attacks. Um, every single indicator for heart disease was negative for me. They didn't understand it. They were, my doctor, again, was looking for all kinds of other stuff he tested me for. And the cardiologists were testing me for this and that and the other thing. And the last time I was at my cardiologist, they were trying to get approval for a test that would measure a genetic indicator for a certain kind of cholesterol that is abnormally produced in 1 in, I think, 5 million people. That's the kind of straws they were grasping at. And of course, that wasn't the case either. They were stumped. So, you know, and of course, all along this time from July, right after my surgery, when all that crap happened and I got interviewed by Jeff, um, it's become clear that my wife was planning to take the baby and go for quite some time. And one night I was talking to my older son, and he came to me with some information that had bothered him ever since he had seen it happening. And he hadn't brought it up at the time because he was afraid to talk about it. He said, "You know, Dad, when you were getting sick, when you were really sick, sometimes I would get up in the middle of the night to pee, and I would sneak really quietly past because I didn't want her to yell at me. And she was awake in the middle of the night while everybody else was asleep, and she was pouring something from a little bottle into your whiskey." I still get a chill down my spine when I hear him say that in my head. I'm getting it right now. It made sense. Everything finally made sense. First thing I did was go to my doctor. I said, "I've recently received some credible information that when I was ill and incapacitated, I was being poisoned over a period of months, deliberately." And I asked him if it was plausible that all of my symptoms had come from something like that. And it was. In fact, it was pretty much the only theory that fit that hadn't been disproven. He told me there's really nothing I can test you for to confirm this. He said, "I can do a heavy metal panel on you, and I'm going to anyway." He said, "But if you had been tested, if you had been poisoned with rat poison or anything else that would have left a heavy metal signature in your body, it would be long gone by now." So he did it, and of course it came up negative, and we talked about it, and you know, the things that you eat and drink um, that cause reactions in your body like that can usually be found in your hair. Um, Hair is used for all kinds of forensic testing. They use it to test for drug use over a long period. Um, it all shows up in your hair. And there are laboratories to test for that. Unfortunately, they're all affiliated with law enforcement. And all the doctors who do the sort of sleuthing that can tell you what you've been poisoned with so that they can test for it in your hair, they're not medical doctors that are attached to a hospital or a practice. They work with law enforcement. He said, you need to go to law enforcement. That's your next step. So I did. State police sent me to the county. County detectives sent me to the local police. The local police listened to me. And, they said, well, you've got credible testimony and you've got lots of medical records to back up that something happened to you, but if we were to launch an investigation based on that, we couldn't prove anything without the hair sample testing and without having a doctor to tell us what to look for in the hair samples. Now, keep in mind, this would be hair samples from 2 years prior, when I was being poisoned. I said, well, are there labs that will do that? And are there doctors that will do that? And he said, well, oh, yeah, but the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania isn't going to pay for that. And I said to him, so what you're telling me is that even though I've got strong, objective reason to believe that I was deliberately poisoned in an attempt to murder me that almost worked, that the Commonwealth isn't going to pay to test whether it happened or not and definitively put a murderer in jail. He said, well, I wouldn't put it that way, but yeah. So after I hung up, so anyway, I got off the phone with them and I sat there. And every time I thought about it, I thought, well, what if she finds out that he saw this? What if she finds out that my son saw this and she decides to get rid of the witness? And where am I going to get the hair samples? Where am I going to get this expert? But of course, the hair samples, they turned out to be the easiest part and also potentially the most complicated. I've been cutting my own hair for the last 10 years. I have a pair of clippers that I do it with. I also trim my hair in other places as well. We're not going to go into that. But the clippers have been doing it all. And I do not clean them because, I'm not the tidiest guy in the world sometimes. And I have a box full of hair samples from the last 10 years, just waiting to be analyzed. So East Pennsboro, they referred me to a laboratory. That's these guys here. They're the ones I have to contact once I decide that I've got, the means to move forward with this. But before I do that, I have to employ a forensic toxicologist who works law enforcement cases. These guys are usually professional witnesses, expert witnesses. And they would have to examine, based on the evidence, what they think I was poisoned with. Now, I did reach out to a guy in another state, and here's what he sent me. As you can see, he requires a substantial retainer, and he's $300 an hour. And God knows how long it would take him to figure it out. And then, if he's called upon to testify against my wife, there would be that additional money, which the Commonwealth isn't going to pay for. So I have to pay a guy to figure out what I was poisoned with, and I have to pay the laboratory to test for it. Over 10 years worth of hair samples. It's a lot. Meanwhile, my son knows what happened. He's smart enough to have figured it out. He knew from my reaction. And he says, Dad, what if she comes after me? And that's scary, What if she does? A person who goes to such lengths to attempt to murder somebody and then only stops because she's afraid of being caught. What if she throws a Molotov through his mom's window in the middle of the night? They've got crap for smoke detectors in that house. What if they do it here? So on top of losing his little brother, on top of losing me, he's got that to worry about too. Now his mom's taking me to court again to try and keep him from me completely. I haven't seen him for a couple weeks. And the last day I saw him, he gave me this. And he said, Dad, can you send this to Elliot? His little brother is too young to read, of course. He's 2 years old now. I don't know if I can read this, but I'm going to try. Dear Elliot, I miss you more than I've ever missed anything in my life. I hope to see you as soon as I can. I would stop and go to see you even if I had to sacrifice doing something that I'd enjoy. I miss seeing you play with your toys, and I miss eating with you. I even miss when you disturb us in the morning. I miss sitting in the back of the car with you, feeding you French fries. It disturbs me mentally that you're not by my side anymore, that I don't see your face anymore. Loving you hurts, but I still do. Love, your brother Jasper. If you can help us, that would be great. Thank you.